Welcome to session 5 of our study on the Apocrypha, the first book of Maccabees. In this session, we will finish reading chapter 9. We will read chapter 10 and the first 40 verses of chapter 11. Our protagonist, you'll remember, is now Jonathan, the youngest brother of Judas Maccabeus. The other surviving brother, Simon, also makes an appearance here, but we introduce Alexander Ballas, and we hear once again from the Egyptian king Ptolemy VI Philometor. There are a few more battles in session 5, but we also see some serious politicking, intrigue, alliance building, and backstabbing. If Judas was a great warrior, his brother Jonathan was a politician. But we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So First Maccabees is one of the books of the Apocrypha. The books of the Apocrypha came from the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Hebrew Bible that was not accepted as scriptural by the Hebrew religion. These books were added to their canon by the Roman Catholic Church, but not by most Protestant churches. Early in the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire took control of a large area near the eastern Mediterranean that included Judea. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes had defiled the temple in Jerusalem, put up altars all over the land, and abolished observance of the Sabbath and circumcision. Matthias, the patriarch of the Maccabean family, rebelled against the Seleucid rulers, and on his deathbed in 165 BCE, commissioned his son, Judas Maccabeus, as commander of the revolutionary army. Judas won some decisive battles against the oppressor of Seleucid, angering Antiochus, who commanded one of his subordinates, Lysias, to wipe out any opposition in Judea, while he, Antiochus IV, went east to Persia to raise funds to expand his armies. Judas cleansed and rededicated the temple in Jerusalem. Antiochus died without ever returning to the western part of his empire. But on his deathbed, he set up a vicious rivalry between Philip, who ruled the eastern part of the empire, and Lysias, the guardian of his son, in the west. Lysias, with a 100,000-man army, attacked, and Eleazar, one of Judas's brothers, was killed in battle. Lysias's army had trapped Judas and his followers and placed them under siege, where they seemed likely to die of starvation, when Lysias heard that his rival was on his way to Antioch, the western capital of the empire. Lysias managed a truce with Judas and hurried back to Antioch to face his rival for the throne, a reprieve for Judas and the Judeans. Lysias was successful in defending the throne of his ward, the 10-year-old Antiochus V, but the son of Antiochus IV's older brother appeared on the scene, had Lysias and his young cousin killed, and ascended to the throne himself as Demetrius I. He appointed a new high priest, Alcimus, to the temple in Jerusalem, and as a commander of his army in the west, he chose Bacchides, a governor of the territory west of the Euphrates. In a pseudo-diplomatic mission to Judea, Bacchides and Alcimus brutally killed 60 scribes who had come to them in peace. Bacchides left Judea, and Demetrius sent another commander, Nicanor, to do battle with Judas and threaten the temple. Nicanor was killed in battle, and once again Judas prevailed. Somewhere during this period, Judas had sent emissaries to Rome to establish an alliance with the Romans, although it seemed at this stage to be more ceremonial than having much impact on military affairs. Demetrius sent Bacchides and Alcimus back to Judea. Greatly outnumbered by Bacchides' armies, Judas' forces were defeated and Judas Maccabeus was killed. Judas's brother, Jonathan, took over the reins of leadership. After additional struggles with Bacchides, the Maccabees were forced into hiding. Another brother, John, was killed, and Jonathan and Simon swam across the Jordan to safety. That brings us to verse 50 of chapter 9, where we begin this session. Then Bacchides returned to Jerusalem and built strong cities in Judea, the fortress in Jericho and Emmaus, and Beth Horon, and Bethel, and Timoth, and Pharagon, and Tephon, with high walls and gates and bars. And he placed garrisons in them to harass Israel. He also fortified the town of Beth Zur, and Gazara, and the citadel, and in them he put troops and stores of food. And he took the sons of the leading men of the land as hostages and put them under guard in the citadel at Jerusalem. So Bacchides built forts in Judea and southern Samaria, strengthened the citadel of Jerusalem, and made hostages of the sons of some of leading men of Judea. So we go on with verses 54 through 57. In the 153rd year, in the second month, Alcimus gave orders to tear down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. He tore down the work of the prophets, but he only began to tear it down, for at that time Alcimus was stricken and his work was hindered. His mouth was stopped and he was paralyzed, so that he could no longer say a word or give commands concerning his house. And Alcimus died at that time in great agony. When Bacchides saw that Alcimus was dead, he returned to the king, and the land of Judah had rest for 2 years. In 159 BCE, the high priest Alcimus had embarked on a project to remodel the temple complex. He ordered torn down the wall separating the Holy of Holies, reserved for the Israelite priests, from the rest of the temple area. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah had overseen the rebuilding of the temple in the late 6th century, and it is suggested that the stroke Alcimus suffered was a punishment for daring to change the design of these prophets. After Alcimus died, we hear no more about a high priest for the next 7 years, so there may not have been one. We read verses 58 through 64. Then all the lawless plotted and said, "See, Jonathan and his men are living in quiet and confidence. So now let us bring Bacchides back, and he will capture them all in one night." And they went and consulted with him. He started to come with a large force and secretly sent letters to all his allies in Judea, telling them to seize Jonathan and his men. But they were unable to do it because their plan had become known. And Jonathan's men seized about 50 of the men of the country who were leaders in this treachery and killed them. Then Jonathan with his men and Simon withdrew to Bethbasai in the wilderness. He rebuilt the parts of it that had not been demolished, and they fortified it. When Bacchides learned of this, he assembled all his forces and sent orders to the men of Judea. Then he came and encamped against Bethbasai. He fought against it for many days and made machines of war. So the lawless we read about in verse 58 would be Jonathan's opponents, either Jewish or Sukliad, who went to Bacchides in 157 and pleaded with him to return to Judah. Jonathan apparently heard about this and killed 50 of the local ringleaders. At this point, Jonathan and Simon withdrew to Bethbasai, which is near Bethlehem and north of Tekoa. So we've read several times in 1 Maccabees about machines of war. The most likely explanation is that these were catapults for shooting stones or arrows. Some of the early catapult designs were similar to crossbows that were fixed in place, perhaps defending a fortress. But that's mostly speculation. Let's go on to verse 65. But Jonathan left his brother Simon in the town while he went out into the country, and he went with only a few men. He struck down Odomera and his kindred and the people of Phaseron in their tents. Then he began to attack and went into battle with his forces. And Simon and his men sallied out from the town and set fire to the machines of war. They fought with Bacchides, and he was crushed by them. They pressed him very hard, for his plan and his expedition had been in vain. So he was very angry at the renegades who had counseled him to come into the country, and he killed many of them. Then he decided to go back to his own land. So Jonathan took a small force and struck down some of the local allies of Bacchides. Then Simon engaged Bacchides directly and defeated him. Out of frustration at having been called out to resolve disputes in Judea, Bacchides directed his anger at the lawless men who had complained to him to begin with. He killed some of them and went home. Verse 70 through the end of the chapter. When Jonathan learned of this, he sent ambassadors to him to make peace with him and obtain release of the captives. He agreed and did as he said, and he swore to Jonathan that he would not try to harm him as long as he lived. He restored to him the captives whom he had taken previously from the land of Judah. Then he turned and went back to his own land, and did not come again into their territory. Thus the sword ceased from Israel. Jonathan settled in Michmash and began to judge the people, and he destroyed the godless out of Israel. So Jonathan proposed another peace treaty and a release of prisoners. Bacchides agreed and said he would leave Jonathan alone in the future. It says there was peace in Judah, but we remember there were still Sukliad troops in Jerusalem and various towns all around the countryside. Jonathan moved to Michmash, which had once been Saul's headquarters back in 1 Samuel 13. Here we in chapter 9, with Jonathan comfortable in his new home where he could stay for the next 5 years. It seems never to be comfortable for the king of the Sukliads, whoever that happens to be. Someone is always trying to get your job. We see another challenger to the throne in chapter 10. So we start with the first 6 verses. In the 160th year, Alexander Epiphanes, son of Antiochus, landed and occupied Ptolemais. They welcomed him, and there he began to reign. When King Demetrius heard of it, he assembled a very large army and marched out to meet him in battle. Demetrius sent Jonathan a letter and peaceable words to honor him. For he said to himself, "Let us act first to make peace with him, before he makes peace with Alexander against us. For he will remember all the wrongs that we did to him, and to his brothers, and to his nation." So Demetrii gave him authority to recruit troops, to equip them with arms, and to become his ally. And he commanded that the hostages in the citadel should be released to him. It is now 152 BCE, and Alexander Balas shows up claiming to be the son of Antiochus IV Epiphanes and wants his throne back. Whether he actually was the son of Antiochus IV is in dispute. Certainly Demetrius I, who currently sits on the throne of the Sukliad Empire, wasn't buying that story. It says Alexander occupied Ptolemais. We have heard of Ptolemais before in chapter 5, when the inhabitants of Sidon, Tyre, and Ptolemais had been harassing the Jews in Galilee, and Judas sent Simon to straighten things out. Ptolemais was a port town northwest of Galilee, south of Tyre and Sidon. Alexander was accepted by the locals as well as by the Romans, who were angry with Demetrius for becoming king without their permission. If you remember, Demetrius was supposed to have been a hostage in Rome, but escaped in 162, 10 years earlier, and headed straight to Antioch to claim the crown as king of the Sukliads. Realizing that Jonathan was the only leader in Judea worth cultivating, Demetrius wrote to Jonathan in peaceful terms, hoping to head off this rebellion or a coup. So we go on with verse 7. Then Jonathan came to Jerusalem and read the letter in the hearing of all the people of those in the citadel. They were greatly alarmed when they heard that the king had given him authority to recruit troops. But those in the citadel released the hostages to Jonathan, and he returned them to their parents. And Jonathan took up residence in Jerusalem and began to rebuild and restore the city. He directed those who were doing the work to build the walls and encircle Mount Zion with squared stones for better fortification, and they did so. So Jonathan took full advantage of this newfound recognition by Demetrius I. This quick rise to prominence frightened both the non-Jews installed in the forts built by the Bacchides and the Jews who had been opposed to Jonathan. We go to verse 12. Then the foreigners who were in the strongholds that Bacchides had built fled. All of them left their places and went back to their own lands. Only at Beth-zur did some remain who had forsaken the law and commandments, for it served as a place of refuge. Now King Alexander heard of all the promises that Demetrius had sent to Jonathan, and he heard of all the battles that Jonathan and his brothers had fought, of their brave deeds that they had done, and of the troubles they had endured. So he said, "Shall we find another such man? Come now, we will make him our friend and ally. And he wrote a letter and sent it to him in the following words. King Alexander to his brother Jonathan, greetings. We have heard about you, that you are a mighty warrior and worthy to be our friend. And so we have appointed you today to be high priest of your nation. You are to be called the king's friend, and you are to take our side and keep friendship with us. He also sent him a purple robe and a golden crown. So Jonathan put on the sacred vestments in the 7th month of the 160th year at the festival of booths. And he recruited troops and equipped them with arms in abundance. Alexander recognized that it would be better to have Jonathan as an ally than as an enemy, so he started a bidding war. Alexander promised to make Jonathan high priest. Jonathan was of a priestly family, but not a descendant of Zadok, which was the legitimate high priestly family. Jonathan saw his opportunity and he took it. He put on the high priestly regalia in late October of 152, gathered an army, and moved to Jerusalem. It's speculated that the Jewish opposition to his moves may have occasioned the beginning of the Qumran sect and the beginning of the temple at Leontopolis in Egypt. So we read verses 22 through 28. When Demetrius heard of these things, he was distressed, and he said, What is this that we have done? Alexander has gotten ahead of us in forming a friendship with the Jews to strengthen himself. I also will write them words of encouragement and promise them honor and gifts so that I may have their help. So he sent a message to them in the following words. King Demetrius, to the nation of the Jews, greetings. Since you have kept your agreement with us and have continued your friendship with us and have not sided with our enemies, we have heard it and rejoiced. Now continue still to keep faith with us, and we will repay you with good for what you do for us. We will grant you many immunities and give you gifts. So trying to stop Alexander in the bidding process, Demetrius wrote a letter with so many extravagant promises that it defied credibility. But note that Demetrius wrote the letter to the Jewish nation, not directly to Jonathan. Listen to all the promises he makes. We read verses 29 through 35. I now free you and exempt all the Jews from payment of tribute and salt tax and crown levies, and instead of collecting the third of one grain and the half of the fruit of the trees that I should receive, I release them from this day and henceforth. I will not collect them from the land of Judah, or from the 3 districts added to it from Samaria and Galilee, from this day and for all time. Jerusalem and its environs, its tithes, its revenues shall be holy and free from tax. I release also my control of the citadel in Jerusalem and give it to the high priest, so that he may station in it men of his own choice to guard it. And every one of the Jews taken as a captive from the land of Judah into any part of my kingdom I set free without payment, and let all officials cancel so also the taxes on their livestock, all the festivals and Sabbaths and new moons and appointed days, and all 3 days before a festival and the 3 after a festival. Let them all be days of immunity and release for all the Jews who are in my kingdom. No one shall have authority to exact anything from them or annoy any of them about any matter. So in verse 32, Demetrius says, I release also my control of the citadel in Jerusalem and give it to the high priest. He still doesn't mention Jonathan by name, but the letter goes on and on, verses 36 to 43. Let Jews be enrolled in the king's forces, so that the number of 30,000 men, and let the maintenance be given to them that is due to all forces of the king. Let some of them be stationed in the great strongholds of the king, and let some of them be put in the positions of trust in the kingdom. Let their officers and leaders be of their own number, and let them live by their own laws, just as the king has commanded in the land of Judah. As for the 3 districts that have been added to Judea from the country of Samaria, let them be annexed to Judea, so that they may be considered to be under one ruler and obey no other authority than the high priest. Ptolemais and the land adjoining it I have given as a gift to the sanctuary in Jerusalem to meet the necessary expenses of the sanctuary. I also grant 15,000 shekels of silver yearly out of the king's revenues from appropriate places, and all the additional funds that the government officials have not paid as they did in the first years, they shall give from now on for the services of the temple. Moreover, the 5,000 shekels of silver that my officials have received every year from the income of the services of the temple, this too is canceled, because it belongs to the priests who minister there. And all who take refuge at the temple in Jerusalem or in any of its precincts because they owe money to the king or in debt, let them be released and receive back all their property in my kingdom. By addressing the Jewish nation and mentioning the high priest without mentioning Jonathan by name, Demetrius may have hoped to lure the people away from Jonathan and his supporters, but the promises still seem too good to be true. Demetrius goes on, verse 44 through 50. Let the cost of rebuilding and restoring the structures of the sanctuary be paid from the revenues of the king, and let the cost of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and fortifying it all around, and the cost of rebuilding the walls in Judea also be paid from the revenues of the king. When Jonathan and the people heard these words, they did not believe or accept them, because they remembered the great wrongs that Demetrius had done in Israel and how much he had oppressed them. They favored Alexander because he had been the first to speak peaceable words to them, and they remained his allies all his days. Now Alexander assembled large forces and encamped opposite Demetrius. The two kings met in battle, and the army of Demetrius fled, and Alexander pursued him and defeated them. He pressed the battle strongly until the sun set. On that day, Demetrius fell. Jonathan and his supporters reject Demetrius' offer and therefore ally themselves with Alexander Balas. In verse 47, it says Alexander had been the first to speak peaceable words to him. That's not quite true, but nevertheless, Jonathan is allied with Alexander, who now feels comfortable in going to war with Demetrius and was successful in that endeavor. We read verses 51 through 58. Then Alexander sent ambassadors to Ptolemy, king of Egypt, with the following message. Since I have returned to my kingdom and have taken my seat on the throne of my ancestors and established my rule, for I crushed Demetrius and gained control of our country, I met him in battle, and he and his army were crushed by us, and we have taken our seat on the throne of his kingdom. Now therefore let us establish friendship with one another. Give me now your daughter as my wife, and I will become your son-in-law, and will make gifts to you and to her in keeping with your position. Ptolemy the king replied and said, Happy was the day on which you returned to the land of your ancestors and took your seat on the throne of their kingdom. And now I will do for you as you wrote, but meet me at Ptolemais, so that we may see one another, and I will become your father-in-law, as you have said. Having gained control of the Seleucid Empire, Alexander saw the need to make peace with the Ptolemaic kingdom based in Egypt by proposing a marriage alliance. The king of Egypt in 150 would have been Ptolemy VI Philometor, the same king we read about Antiochus IV defeating back in the first chapter. The daughter in question here is Cleopatra Thea, who later married Demetrius II and still later his brother Antiochus VI. But that's getting ahead of our story. Alexander's proposal was that Ptolemy give Cleopatra to him as his wife, and Alexander in return gave many gifts. Ptolemy doesn't reject the offer, but suggests that they meet. We read verses 57 and 58. So Ptolemy set out from Egypt, he and his daughter Cleopatra, and came to Ptolemais in the 162nd year. King Alexander met him, and Ptolemy gave him his daughter Cleopatra in marriage, and celebrated her wedding at Ptolemais with great pomp, as kings do. So apparently the meeting went well. We had a wedding. Go on to verse 59. Then King Alexander wrote to Jonathan to come and meet him. So he went with pomp to Ptolemais and met the two kings. He gave them and their friends silver and gold and many gifts, and found favor with them. A group of malcontents from Israel, renegades, gathered together against him to accuse him, but the king paid no attention to them. The king gave orders to take off Jonathan's garments and to clothe him in purple. And they did so. The king also seated him at his side and said to his officers, "Go out with him into the middle of the city and proclaim that no one is to bring charges against him about any matter, and let no one annoy him for any reason." When his accusers saw the honor that was paid to him in accord with the proclamation and saw him clothed in purple, they all fled. Thus the king honored him and enrolled him among his chief friends and made him general and governor of the province. And Jonathan returned to Jerusalem in peace and gladness. Now Jonathan is made military commander and governor of Judea and gets a get out of jail free card from the Seleucid king Alexander. We go on with verses 67 through 73. In the 165th year, Demetrius, son of Demetrius, came from Crete to the land of his ancestors. When King Alexander heard of it, he was greatly distressed and returned to Antioch. And Demetrius appointed Apollonius, the governor of Colostria, and he assembled a large force and encamped against Jamnia. Then he sent the following message to the high priest Jonathan: "You are the only one to rise up against us, and I have fallen into ridicule and disgrace because of you. Why do you assume authority against us in the hill country? If you now have confidence in your forces, come down to the plain to meet us, and let us match strength with each other there, for I have with me the power of the cities. Ask and learn who I am and who the others are that are helping us. People will tell you that you cannot stand before us, for your ancestors were twice put to flight in their own land, and now you will not be able to withstand my cavalry and such an army in the plain, where there is no stone or pebble or place to flee." So in 147 BCE, Demetrius II Nicator, son of Demetrius I, was about 14 years old. He appoints Apollonius as governor of Col Isarius, which is basically the area of Palestine, which includes Judea. Apollonius gathered a large army on the Mediterranean coast at Jamnia and sends a challenge to Jonathan. So we go on with verses 74 through 81. When Jonathan heard the words of Apollonius, his spirit was aroused. He chose 10,000 men and set out from Jerusalem, and his brother Simon met him to help him. He encamped before Joppa, but the people of the city closed its gates, for Apollonius had a garrison in Joppa. So they fought against it, and the people of the city became afraid and opened the gates, and Jonathan gained possession of Joppa. When Apollonius heard of it, he mustered 3,000 cavalry and a large army and went to Azotus, as though he were going further. At the same time, he advanced into the plain, for he had a large troop of cavalry and put confidence in it. Jonathan pursued him to Azotus, and the armies engaged in battle. Now Apollonius had secretly left 1,000 cavalry behind them. Jonathan learned that there was an ambush behind him, for they surrounded his army and shot arrows at his men from early morning till late afternoon. But his men stood fast, as Jonathan had commanded, and the enemy's horses grew tired. By heading south to Azotus, Apollonius hoped to lure Jonathan out onto the plain, where his advantage and the size of his army could be better exploited. He also left a cavalry behind to set ambush to trap him, but Jonathan managed to hold out against Apollonius' forces in front of him. So verses 82 through the end of the chapter. Then Simon brought forward his forces and engaged the phalanx in battle, for the cavalry was exhausted. They were overwhelmed by him and fled. The cavalry was dispersed in the plain. They fled to Azotus and entered Beth Dagon, the temple of their idol, for safety. But Jonathan burned Azotus and the surrounding towns and plundered them. And the temple of Dagon and those who had taken refuge in it he burned with fire. The number of those who fell by the sword and those burned alive came to 8,000. Then Jonathan left there and encamped against Askelon, and the people at that city came out to meet him with great pomp. He and those with him then returned to Jerusalem with a large amount of booty. When King Alexander heard of these things, he honored Jonathan still more, and he sent him a golden buckle, such as is the custom to give the king's kinsmen. He also gave him Ekron and all its environs as his possession. Simon defeated the phalanx, and Jonathan showed no mercy to those enemy who sought refuge in the temple of Dagon at Azotus. Jonathan returned to Jerusalem with much plunder and was rewarded by Alexander. We go now to chapter 11. We will read the first 40 verses of chapter 11 today and finish the chapter in session 6. We'll see some more power grabs here, more changes of rulers and new alliances. We begin with an attempted coup. So chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Then the king of Egypt gathered great forces, like the sand by the seashore, and many ships. He tried to get possession of Alexander's kingdom by trickery and add to his own kingdom. He set out for Syria with peaceable words, and the people of the towns opened their gates to him and went to meet him, for King Alexander had commanded them to meet him, since he was Alexander's father-in-law. But when Ptolemy entered the towns, he stationed forces as a garrison in each town. As Alexander's father-in-law, Ptolemy was able to exploit this relationship to freely enter the cities that belonged to Alexander, and once there, establish his own troops. Let's read verses 4 through 12. When he approached Azotus, they showed him the burnt-out temple of Dagon and Azotus and its suburbs destroyed, and the corpses lying about, and the charred bodies of those whom Jonathan had burned in the war, for they had piled them in heaps along his route. They also told the king what Jonathan had done, to throw blame on him, but the king kept silent. Jonathan met the king at Joppa with pomp, and they greeted one another and spent the night there. And Jonathan went with the king as far as the river called Eleutheris. Then he returned to Jerusalem. So King Ptolemy gained control of the coastal cities as far as Seleucia by the sea, and he kept devising wicked designs against Alexander. He sent envoys to King Demetrius, saying, "Come, let us make a covenant with each other, and I will give you in marriage my daughter, who is Alexander's wife, and you shall reign over your father's kingdom. I now regret that I gave him my daughter, for he tried to kill me. He threw blame on Alexander because he coveted his kingdom. So he took his daughter away from him and gave her to Demetrius. He was estranged from Alexander, and their enmity became manifest." Ptolemy began to put his plan against Alexander into action by seizing Seleucia by the sea, the port city of Antioch, that was loyal to Demetrius too. Then he proposed an alliance with Demetrius too that would involve giving his daughter, who was already married to Alexander, to Demetrius. There had been an attempt to kill Ptolemy, and the would-be assassin was a friend of Alexander. Ptolemy's real objective here was to force a sharp break from Alexander and make the Seleucid kingdom part of his own kingdom. We go to verse 13. Then Ptolemy entered Antioch and put on the crown of Asia. Then he put 2 crowns on his head, the crown of Egypt and that of Asia. Now King Alexander was in Cilicia at that time, because the people of that region were in revolt. When Alexander heard of it, he came against him in battle. Ptolemy marched out and met him with a strong force and put him to flight. So Alexander fled to Arabia to find protection there, and King Ptolemy was triumphant. Zabdiel, the Arab, cut off the head of Alexander and sent it to Ptolemy. But King Ptolemy died 3 days later, and his troops in the strongholds were killed by the inhabitants of the strongholds. So Demetrius became king in the 167th year. So Alexander fled to Arabia, the northern desert east of Damascus, where he was beheaded by Zabdiel. Ptolemy was injured in the battle and died a few days later. The men in the garrison were also killed off. So that allowed Demetrius II to become king by default in 145 BCE. We go on with verses 20 through 29. In those days, Jonathan assembled the Judeans to attack the citadel in Jerusalem, and he built many engines of war to use against it. But certain renegades who hated their nation went to the king and reported to him that Jonathan was besieging the citadel. When he heard this, he was angry, and as soon as he heard it, he set out and came to Ptolemais, and he wrote Jonathan not to continue the siege, but to meet him for a conference at Ptolemais as quickly as possible. When Jonathan heard this, he gave orders to continue the siege. He chose some of the elders of Israel and some of the priests and put himself in danger, for he went to the king at Ptolemais, taking silver and gold and clothing and numerous other gifts. And he won his favor, although certain renegades of his nation kept making complaints against him. The king treated him as his predecessors had treated him. He exalted him in the presence of all his friends. He confirmed him in the high priesthood and in many other honors, as he had formerly had, and caused him to be reckoned among his chief friends. Then Jonathan asked the king to free Judea and the 3 districts of Samaria from tribute, and promised him 300 talents. The king consented and wrote a letter to Jonathan about all these things. Its contents were as follows. So the political confusion surrounding the Seleucids and the Ptolemies gave Jonathan another opportunity to try to gain control over the citadel in Jerusalem. Demetrius hears about this and asks to meet with Jonathan. Jonathan continues with the siege, but goes to meet with Demetrius. He makes a request that Judea and the 3 districts of Samaria be exempted from taxes in exchange for a one-time payment of 300 talents. We read Demetrius' response. King Demetrius, to his brother Jonathan and to the nation of the Jews, greetings. This copy of the letter that we wrote concerning you to our kinsman Lasthenes we have written to you also, so that you may know what it says. King Demetrius, to his father Lasthenes, greetings. We have determined to do good to the nation of the Jews, who are our friends, and fulfill their obligations to us because of the goodwill they show toward us. We have confirmed as their possession both the territory of Judea and the 3 districts of Ephraim and Lada and Rathman. The latter, with all the region bordering them, were added to Judea from Samaria. To all those who offer sacrifice in Jerusalem, we have granted release from the royal taxes that the king formerly received from them each year, from the crops of the land and the fruit of the trees, and the other payments henceforth due to us of the tithes, and the taxes due to us in the salt pits, and the crown taxes due us. From all these we grant them release, and not one of these grants shall be canceled from this time on forever. Now therefore take care to make a copy of this, and let it be given to Jonathan to put up as in a conspicuous place on the holy mountain. This letter purports to be a copy of the king's letter to Lasthenes, who is described as the kinsman and father to Demetrius too. Lasthenes was probably the real power behind this young king, who is again 14, 15 years old. The body of the letter confirms the addition of 3 districts to Jonathan's territory of Judea and exempts them all from paying taxes to Demetrius too. Those revenues were to go instead to the Jerusalem temple, where Jonathan was the high priest. The agreement was to be made public by displaying the text in the Temple Mount. Let's go on with verses 38 through 40. When King Demetrius saw that the land was quiet before him, and that there was no opposition to him, he dismissed all his troops, all of them to their own homes, except the foreign troops that he had recruited from the islands of the nations. So all the troops who had served under his predecessors hated him. A certain Trypho had formerly been one of Alexander's supporters. He saw that all the troops were grumbling against Demetrius. So he went to Imalchu, the Arab, who was bringing up Antiochus, the young son of Alexander, and insistently urged him to hand Antiochus over to him to become king in place of his father. He also reported to Imalchu what Demetrius had done and told of the hatred that the troops of Demetrius had for him, and he stayed there many days. Both Alexander Balas and Ptolemy were dead, so Demetrius had no real opposition at this point. He dismissed his local soldiers, probably so he didn't have to continue paying them. The local soldiers figured this out and resented it because, well, they no longer had jobs or income. The plan eventually backfired, which we will see in our next session. Meanwhile, Diodotos Trypho persuaded the guardian of Alexander Balas' son to allow the boy to become known as King Antiochus VI. Do we sense another coup coming in the Suclean Empire? In session 6, we read the conclusion of chapter 11. We will read and discuss chapter 12 and 13. Until then, be safe. We'll see you Sunday.